indefensible, I believe. And I would hope that, that there would be a recognition of that in this town.
Yeah, as a historian, a little piece of me died when I was reading those passages of the book about these records, these valuable records being destroyed, and those are our records.
Right.
But now we can't access them.
It does seem to me that if you can't at least retrospectively look at what happened in these cases, your odds of being able to do better in the future are not as good as they might be. That raises a quick question I wanted to ask Gary about the too big to fail in the crisis. When you wrote your book, it hadn't extended to investment banks at all. That wasn't something you anticipated. But that raises a final question about the whole role of investment banking and with respect to Citibank, Glass-Steagall, and all that. I hope that perhaps we could end with a quick discussion of what role, if any, Glass-Steagall or its partial rollback played in Citibank's most recent problem.
Well, you'll have to ask the Citibank experts. I would simply observe that, you know, the other high-profile cases were Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, AIG, none of whom were commercial banks or did any significant commercial banking business, so far as I know. So I personally don't think Glass-Steagall, one way or the other, had played much of a role, but I will defer to people who've looked at it more carefully.
As far as what we found in our research on the 30s, which was the initiation of Glass-Steagall, I mean, before I started looking into this, I really thought the history was that there was instability that washed over from the investment banking side to the commercial banking side.
Because in those days, Citi had both already, right?
Right.
This was before Glass-Steagall.
But we found no evidence of that. They got into trouble in the late 20s and early 30s, but it was the international side, Germany, Chile, a number of other countries, and that put them on the brink. They got money from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, similar to what Chase and Continental did. But maybe I was just naive going into it, or I'd gotten some bad information, but there was never really any spillover from the investment bank to the commercial bank. They were worried about it, and we found in some of the communication between the examiners and the OCC headquarters that they were concerned about it. They wanted details on NCC, National Citicorp, which was the investment banking affiliate, but there was really no spillover at all, and I think that was kind of an urban myth that hopefully we can work to dispel.
Same thing in 2008?
Well, I would say in 2008, you did have problems in the investment bank, but you also had them in the commercial bank. I think one of the myths of 2008 is people tended to want to blame particular financial instruments, whether a credit default swap or a collateralized debt obligation, and different analyses of that crisis have tried to often to make a point that one instrument being less regulated than another, aha, that was the problem. I think you look at it and you look at Citi, you look at the problem generally. The problem was housing. The problem was widespread. And within Citi, what you see is commercial bank, investment bank, big problems, big losses on housing across the board, from the most simple instruments to the most complex.
And of the 5 times that Citi did get in trouble, every time there was a big problem on the commercial bank, the credit side, the lending side, and the investment banking side wasn't the core of what the problem was.
Thanks. We're going to open it up for the last 15 minutes or so, perhaps a little less, to the audience for questions and answers. Please wait for the mic to come to you before you ask your question so that everybody can hear, and say your name and affiliation before asking your question, and do finally ask a question rather than make a spiel or something like that. I'm going to take 2 questions at a time, 1, 2 to start with, so that you both have mics ready, and whoever gets the mic first can start. Did you have a question here, sir?
Hi.
Yes, question.
Should I
Please.
start?
And direct your question to a particular speaker if you can.
Yeah. I'm Swami Iyer of the Cato Institute. I would like to ask, surely you need a better definition of what this word rescue means. In 2008, certainly the depositors of Citibank were rescued. But the share price, which at its peak was, I think, close to $60, fell to $1 at the point of so-called rescue. So, even today it's gone up 6 times or 7 times. It's still about, you lost 90% of your money. So if I have lost 90 to 99% of my money, is the word rescue appropriate? I mean, I think, don't you need to use a different kind of word? The specific question I have is, suppose the bank had been liquidated. Would the shareholders have got less money than they actually have?
It's a rescue of uninsured creditors. It's a rescue of the institution. It's often a rescue of the board. Boards often don't want to go through a bankruptcy process. Not so much fun for a director, but it's mainly in terms of, and I guess I defer to the others, but in terms of studying the impact. But it's the creditors who have that belief that, and it was vindicated in 2008, that they will be covered in a crisis.
And as far as your mention of a 90% drop, I mean, that's assuming that you sold at the absolute worst possible time at the bottom. And I mean, you're right, in most cases, the liquidation scenario, the shareholders would be out. But I'm sorry.
Yeah, the problem is, I wouldn't make a distinction between shareholders and creditors. I make a distinction between insured and uninsured creditors. So if the deposit insurance limit, as it was prior to the crisis, was $100,000, and you had $50,000 in the bank, you appropriately expected that your $50,000 fully protected, and you had no concerns, and you had no incentive to monitor the bank one way or the other. But if you're a corporate treasurer with $5 million in Citi, your protections should be $100,000, and then you've got whatever that different $4.9 million at risk, but it wasn't really at risk in a too big to fail institution, and that's the nub of the problem, because corporate treasurers are not fools. They know they're protected, and they similarly have no incentive to monitor the bank.
I mean, the point I was trying to make is just the differential treatment of all these institutions. If you compare what happened to Lehman Brothers versus Washington Mutual versus Bear Stearns versus AIG and versus Fannie and Freddie, I mean, it's across the board that there was some of them made out pretty well, whether it's Bear Stearns or otherwise, and Fannie and Freddie on the other end, they took a pretty big hit, essentially taking all the future profits of the institution for 6 or 8 years into the future. So I think that was one of the big issues about uncertainty for the creditors. Everybody got treated differently, and there was no rhyme or reason to how the decision-making was being implemented.
Hi, Eric Grover with Intrepid Ventures. My question, I guess, for Vernon and James. America has long had one of the most developed, politicized banking systems in the developed world, which may contribute to the periodic banking crises and bailouts of politically connected banks. Could you speculate on any paths that you might see to a less politicized banking system, and a system where the market plays a greater role in regulating the banking system?
I think I'd love to see politicians just start shrinking the safety net. And I understand that you can't announce that tomorrow all the rules have changed, but just an incremental process back toward that model that worked pretty well. We enjoyed and benefited from George's work on the financial system in the 19th century, even while the government was making a lot of mistakes in terms of restricting the money supply and unit banking and the rest of it, you still had banks that were free to fail, and a economy that was growing, I believe, at 4% or better in real terms for the last 3 decades of the 19th century.
Yeah, during the next crisis, I mean, the regulators, whether it's OCC, FDIC, the Fed, have a lot of discretion, and it really is important who's in those positions. If you have people like Mark Calabria, who's here at Cato for many years, he's now working for Vice President Pence as chief economist. If someone like him ends up in one of these positions and is the decision maker, I've got a lot of confidence. Hester Peirce, who's at SEC, I've got confidence of her, but it's really a crapshoot as far as who's going to be in power, who's going to be at the Treasury and the FDIC, the OCC, and the Fed that's going to be making these decisions. So, I mean, I don't think there's any silver bullet before that point in time where we know when the crisis has started and we know the lineup of people who's going to be making the decisions.
If I could interject, because my name was brought up in this connection with this question. Actually, the United States in the 19th century would not be my recommended ideal system by any stretch of the imagination. It had some virtues compared to today, but it had many problems that were distinct. But the Canadian system had a fine history both in the 19th century and more recently, showing a great deal more resilience. And I think part of the secret is that they avoided the extremes of unit banking. First of all, they allowed a well-developed system to grow with banks that were sizable, but without with a more competitive system, and without inviting too big to fail. And they resisted guarantees a lot longer than we did, and still do, as far as I can tell. But certainly, I think that we need to look beyond the U.S. experience to find some good examples of institutional arrangements that we might benefit from emulating.
Yeah, I should just say we did write about a lot of the problems with banking in that era, but what you would love to bring back is that phenomenon of a banker like James Stillman running Citi, who probably never dreamed that the government would be rescuing him if he ran into trouble.
All right, a couple more questions there, and I see your hand, and we'll have time, I hope, to get to you as well.
Hi. Tom Gaspard. I'm local, Potomac, Maryland. But full disclosure, I spent my life at Citi up until about the year 2000. And my question is about, I want to go back to this issue of investment versus commercial bank. And just no long speeches, but a little backdrop. When I got there, Walter Wriston was a god, I'll tell you. And I don't know as he thought the government would bail him out, but I never got the chance to ask him. But one thing was for sure, these places were publicly owned companies, and competition was, that's all we heard was competition. We wanted to be kings of the hill. I was on the consumer side, but